The year was 1955. Montgomery was over 200 days into the bus boycott. A boycott organized by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church there in Montgomery. The very next day, after the 200-day anniversary of the boycott, where 85% of the black community had bought into the boycott to overcome racial segregation on the bus lines there in Montgomery, they had planned a huge rally. They were expecting thousands of people within Montgomery to show up the very next day for a massive rally in which Dr. King was going to speak. The economic merchants of Montgomery were starting to feel the pinch on the through the bus boycott. It wasn't just the bus line, but it was starting to affect commerce in Montgomery. It was starting to affect the popularity of politicians in Montgomery. And the movement really felt like they were making some good progress. So the night before the big rally in Montgomery in 1955, Dr. King goes to bed when Coretta wakes him up around 2:30 in the morning, saying that she hears a noise downstairs and that he should go and check it out. Dr. King reaches underneath the bed for the baseball bat, which he kept underneath his bed every single night that he slept at home. And he walked downstairs, turning on the lights as he went, hoping against hope that he would find nothing jumping out around a corner as he searched through the home. Luckily, there wasn't anyone inside the King house. So King goes to the kitchen, puts the baseball bat on the kitchen table, and turns on the kitchen light. And at the same time that the light goes on, the phone rings at 2:30 in the morning. King picks it up, and on the other line is the voice of a man saying that if King did not back off and did not cancel the rally the next day, that they would be bombing the King home with Coretta, and at the time, their one small child inside. And click. King hangs up the phone, goes over to the counter, makes a pot of coffee, and then sits down at the kitchen table, and for the next 4 hours, until Coretta herself wakes up, King pours his heart out to God, asking God to take from him this cup. That if there is any way that someone else could do this work, to please let that person come forward, to take this burden off of him. He pours out his soul to God, saying he is not up to the challenge. He doesn't have the gifts and graces. He's not strong enough to hold this for not only Montgomery, but his family and for his church. He begs God to take this burden away from him. And as the sun came up on that fateful morning in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, and the clouds parted and the sun shone into the King kitchen, the words came to King that he was praying to hear from God. It wasn't, I release you of your responsibility. It wasn't, I will find somebody else. No, the words that King heard from God that morning was, Martin, I promise to never leave you alone. I will be with you every moment of your life, no matter what occurs. There is a saying in the black church that really speaks to this faith, that God will never leave us alone. The saying goes something like this: you never know when God will show up, but God always shows up on time. King needed God in that moment. and in communication and relationship with God as he poured his soul out to God at that kitchen table over that cup of coffee. King heard in a very important way that God knew where and when God needed Martin to show up, but Martin also heard that God would be there wherever he was, wherever Martin showed up. In a BBC interview on the eve before he received his Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. King spoke about the power of persistent prayer. So many of us say, I would love to live a life like Dr. King. Sisters and brothers, let me say to you one way in which all of us, regardless of who we are, can live into a life that is set by the example of Dr. King is all of us can be about the power of persistent prayer. That belief in the power of persistent prayer would be a hallmark in King's life and ministry to his dying day. Prayer was a consistent part of King's spiritual life and discipline. It was the very source and wellspring of his hope and trust and courage and perseverance. Dr. Lewis Baldwin, a professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt University, wrote a fantastic book named after the very thing that King heard from God that morning in Montgomery, never to leave us alone. And I'm going to give this to Penny Ward and put it in our church's library. Dr. Baldwin writes about the spiritual life and practice of Dr. King in the book, saying this: in order to understand Dr. King, you must begin with the idea of him as a Christian and as a spiritual leader. King always made it clear that his civil rights and justice activities were an extension of his Christian ministry and an extension of his faith in God. Dr. King's personal devotional life was very, very important in giving him the courage and determination, but it also contributed to his ever-expanding views and his work on poverty and his anti-war beliefs. Finally, King spent hours in prayer, either quietly behind closed doors in his study or in the kitchen pouring his heart out to God over a cup of coffee. Prayer gave him a great deal of perspective and it helped him process his public successes, his setbacks, and grounded King in the moral and ethics of the Christian faith. We know Dr. King as this great civil rights prophet who called us to our better selves and our nation to uphold our highest ideals. We know the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a powerful orator and preacher who dared us to dream of a day when the sons and daughters of former slaves and the sons and daughters of former slave owners could sit down at the table of fellowship, and who showed courage of how not to fear anything or any man, for he had been to the mountaintop and he had seen the coming of the glory of the Lord. But do we know Martin? Brother Martin, a person just like you who sat in the pews of churches, who was a person of profound faith and trust in God, a person, Brother Martin, who spent hours in time in prayer and meditation each day in communion with God. The rest of America wants to forget and neglect this side of Brother Martin. They want to make Dr. King this two-dimensional cutout. They want to make him the black Santa Claus in which we climb up on his lap once a year and we tell him about our dream of racial harmony in our country. They want to commodify this holiday and make it about sales on mattresses and washers and dryers. You can get a good sale this weekend, sisters and brothers. Politicians all weekend long are going to be spouting off platitudes and misquoting Dr. King to their own devices and schemes. Don't fall for it. They don't believe a word he said. But we here at Kensington Community Church, we will not only claim him as prophet, we will not only claim him as preacher, but we will claim Martin, our brother in Christ, as one of our own who sat in those pews and developed a deep faith and trust in God, who was a disciplined person of prayer, who found strength to carry on because he knew he was a child of God, loved by God, and rested in the very palm of God's grace. Thank you. And furthermore, I contend to you, sisters and brothers, that we wouldn't even have the prophet and the preacher if it wasn't for Brother Martin being a man of deep Christian conviction. Listen to the words that we heard early in our service, that part of the I have a dream speech. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places made plain, and the crooked places made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith I go back to the south with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. That is King, either directly or paraphrasing the books of Isaiah, Psalms, and Revelation. Where did he learn those things? In church, in the pew, in Sunday school. He is using the very words of his deep and profound Christian beliefs and faith, and he is relying on God's promises to spur a nation and her people to live into the powerful and magnificent dream of peace and togetherness. And how did he decide on these words of this very famous speech that he gave on the mall in Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial? According to the story, after hearing from all of his advisors on the day before the March on Washington, King thanked them all for their wisdom and counsel. Then he retreated to his hotel room, and as he shut the door in his friends' faces, said, "My friends, I appreciate all the suggestions, but now let me go and be with counsel with the Lord." He prayed all night before the March on Washington on what he should say to the nation. And when his prepared remarks were not going as well as what he thought they should, in the background, just a little voice of the gospel singer Malia Jackson says, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he goes away from his prepared remarks, and he gives us everything that we have come to own and make and be inspired by. What gave those words to him? Prayer. Prayer gave him those words. What gave him clarity? Prayer. What gave him courage? Prayer. It gave him perspective and perseverance. It allows us, sisters and brothers, to see the moral arc of the universe laid out in front of us, and lets us know that even when we don't know it, that we are making progress, even if we don't feel it. God's gifts of prayer gives us perfect 100% 20/20 vision. It allows us to discern how we can use our own creative, and you have so many creative and graces and gifts to participate in the moral imagination of the Holy Spirit in our midst, to make your lives and our country and our community a better place. These things start to make sense and give us depth and dimension when we allow ourselves to sit with God in prayer. Prayer grants us courage to face the days ahead, no matter how troubling they may seem. For it's in prayer that we feel the persistent love of God in our midst, the God whose very essence is love, and the God whose love promises and covenants with us to never let us alone. Now, there are lots of websites and books out there who are going to teach you and tell you that there is a proper way to pray. Put those away and close those windows. Those things are bogus. You don't have to sit up straight to make sure you're aligned perfectly, that your chakras are all in the right order. You want to pray over a cup of coffee deep in the morning of the bewitching hour? You want to take a walk in the hills? You want to sit silently on a cushion? You want to tap into that power of persistent prayer? You want to pour out your soul and yell at God for the injustices of the world? Just do it, sisters and brothers, and be in prayer with God. For as the prayer life of Dr. Martin, or Brother Martin, tells us, is that prayer can be a balm for our sin-sick soul. It can allow us to know that we are in God's hand, that precious hand, and that he is leading us home. Many of you are like me this morning, and you woke up and saw a video of a young man from Kentucky who was doing a despicable thing. You saw in this morning a young man jeering and mocking an American Indian leader named Nathan Phillips in Washington, D.C. As Mr. Phillips, a leader of the Omaha Nation, a tribe in Nebraska, was in Washington, D.C. for his annual tribute to American Indians who had served our country through military service, and many of them who had given their lives in the name of that service. If you were like me, when you saw the attitude and the actions of this young man, it broke your heart. To have this young man feel that it was okay to mock and to ridicule Mr. Phillips shook me to my core. It reminded me of the words from our psalm, that there is deceit, and there is mischief, and there is no fear of God, and there is nothing telling them not to do evil. Now, I have been in the birthplace of Brother Martin, off of Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. I have been in the kitchen where Martin ate breakfast and gave grace over the family dinner. I have stood in the living room where he told his mother and father that he felt a calling from God and he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather in ministry. I've walked through his bedroom where his mother knelt beside him next to his bed for evening prayers, and he fell asleep asking God to protect him as he slept. In that home, Brother Martin's faith and deep trust in the everlasting love and steadfastness of God formed him, fashioned him, nurtured him, brought him to blossom. Brother Martin's knowledge that he was an ever-living, that every little thing was loved completely and fully by God was instilled not only in his mind, but was imprinted on his heart and his soul by that house. Dr. King, Brother Martin was incubated in that home and brought to fruition in his church by hearing the words of Jesus. He read the poems of the Psalms. He prayed to God who would never leave him no matter how hard the times came. And when I read the story this morning about the young man from Kentucky, all I could think about was, my God, how much better his life would be if he had been raised in the King home. He's a young man. That didn't happen by accident. His ridicule and his mocking was a product of the environment in which he was raised. And yet, sisters and brothers, we are called by Dr. King this day. And let me tell you, Mr. Phillips is going to be okay because he is a man of deep faith and persistent prayer, and he will know the power of forgiveness to this young man. The question for us this day, sisters and brothers, is, are we willing to forgive this young man this day? Or are we going to be like the Twitterverse and the Instagram and the comments on the newspaper and the talking heads on the television, and we're just going to lambast and we're going to cajole and we're going to condemn a 15-year-old boy? Or are we going to live into the dream of Dr. King, which is to forgive him and then to find him in our neighborhood? Because if you do not think that he lives here in Kensington, Normal Heights, Talmadge, City Heights, San Diego, California, the United States of America, then you are naive. He lives next to you. And we need to find him. And we need to pray for him. And we need to walk with him so that we may truly live out and bring to fruition the dream of Dr. King in our midst. Do you believe in the persistent power of prayer to allow the dream to become real? I hope so. I really, really hope so. Amen.